the houses that whisper. I hope tonight finds you somewhere safe, somewhere quiet, ready to drift. Before we begin our journey together, if these stories speak to you in the stillness, a gentle tap on like or subscribe helps others find their way here too. There are houses that hold secrets, not the kind written in diaries or whispered between lovers, but the kind that move in the rafters, that breathe in crawl spaces, that watch from behind walls. These are the secrets of presence, unseen, uninvited, impossibly close. We like to believe we know our homes. We walk their hallways in darkness, our feet finding familiar floorboards, our hands reaching for light switches without thought. We understand the sounds they make, the settling of old wood, the whisper of wind through poorly sealed windows, the groan of pipes carrying water through hidden veins. These noises become a kind of language, one we learn to translate until our homes feel like extensions of ourselves. But what happens when a new sound appears? A footstep where no one walks, a creak in the attic when everyone sleeps below, a shadow that moves against the logic of light. The stories we carry tonight are not tales of ghosts or spirits, though they may feel that way in their telling. They're accounts of something perhaps more unsettling, the living hidden among us, occupying the forgotten spaces of our most private sanctuaries. These are the uninvited, the unseen watchers, the quiet residents of places they were never meant to be. Some have wondered what drives a person to vanish into the margins of another's life. What calculus of desperation or darkness leads someone to choose the crawl space over the street, the attic over the open world? Perhaps it begins with simple need: shelter from cold, escape from consequence, a place to hide when nowhere else remains. But as hours become days and days stretch into weeks, something else takes root. A strange intimacy develops between the hidden and the unknowing. The watcher learns the rhythms of those below, when they wake, when they sleep, when they are most vulnerable. The home becomes a stage, and its rightful inhabitants become performers in a show they never agreed to join. Tonight, we will visit 3 such places. First, a farmstead in Bavaria where footsteps echoed through empty rooms, and a family waited for a killer who may have been living above them all along. Then, a quiet house in Denver where a man's ceiling became another man's floor, where warmth rose through floorboards to someone who had no right to feel it. And finally, a small apartment in Osaka where a woman made herself so thin, so silent, so invisible, that she lived for months in a space barely large enough to contain her. These stories span decades and continents, yet they share something essential: a violation of the boundary between self and other, between private and observed, between the space we think we own and the hidden corners we never think to check. We begin our journey in the way of all journeys into the unknown, by acknowledging what we think we know, then learning how little that knowledge protects us. The home is supposed to be our refuge: 4 walls and a roof, a door that locks, windows that keep the world at bay. Inside these boundaries, we shed our public selves. We move through rooms in old clothes or no clothes at all. We speak words we would never say in company. We become vulnerable in ways we can never be vulnerable elsewhere. This vulnerability requires absolute trust. Trust that the locked door stays locked, that the walls are solid, that the spaces above and below and beside us contain only air and insulation and the ordinary infrastructure of shelter. But sometimes that trust is misplaced. Architects and builders know that every house contains negative space: the voids between floors, the hollows behind walls, the dark triangles under roof peaks. These spaces exist for practical reasons, allowing air to circulate, providing access to electrical systems and plumbing, creating the structural framework that keeps everything standing. They are the house's secret anatomy, the parts we're not meant to see or think about. Most of these spaces are too small, too awkward, too uncomfortable for human occupation. They belong to mice and insects, to dust and forgotten things. We might venture into them once or twice, to run a new wire, to investigate a leak, to retrieve something dropped between the cracks. But we don't linger there. They aren't meant for lingering, except when someone decides otherwise. The stories of hidden intruders follow certain patterns. They begin with small disturbances: food that goes missing, items moved from their usual places, sounds that can't quite be explained. The residents notice these things but dismiss them. Memory plays tricks after all. Perhaps they ate more than they thought, moved things themselves while distracted, misheard the sounds of an old building settling, but the disturbances continue, they accumulate, a feeling develops, the sense of being watched, of presence where there should be absence. Some describe it as a change in the air, a weight that presses down when they enter certain rooms. Others speak of catching movement in their peripheral vision, fleeting and impossible to verify when they turn to look directly. This is when the rationalizations begin to crack. This is when people start checking locks obsessively, peering into closets before bed, lying awake and listening to their homes with new suspicion. And sometimes they discover they were right to be suspicious. The revelation, when it comes, almost always arrives as a shock despite the mounting evidence. Our minds resist the conclusion until it becomes unavoidable. We would rather believe in ghosts than accept that a living person has been sharing our most intimate spaces, watching us sleep, listening to our conversations, existing in the negative spaces of our lives. Ghosts at least lack agency. They are echoes, recordings, impressions left in the fabric of a place. But a living intruder is making choices, choosing to enter, choosing to stay, choosing to watch and wait and remain hidden. There is intention in their presence, calculation in their concealment. This is what makes these stories so deeply unsettling. Not the hiding itself, but the active decision to hide, hour after hour, day after day, while life continues unaware just beyond a thin barrier of wood or plaster or fabric. Some cases become famous, entering the folklore of true crime and urban mystery. Others remain obscure, known only to the families who lived them and the investigators who documented them. But each one adds to our collective unease, reinforcing the uncomfortable truth that our homes are not as secure as we imagine, that the boundaries between private and invaded are more porous than we want to believe. Tonight's 3 stories come from different eras and different corners of the world, yet they speak to the same primal fear, the fear of the hidden watcher, the uninvited presence, the other who exists in our space without our knowledge or consent. Before we enter the first of these haunted spaces, it's worth considering what we mean when we say a place is haunted. The word usually conjures images of spectral figures, cold spots, doors that open by themselves. But perhaps the truest haunting is simpler and more terrible. It is the knowledge that you were never alone when you thought you were, that privacy was an illusion, that someone was there in the darkness, breathing your air, existing in your blind spots. This kind of haunting doesn't end when the intruder is discovered and removed. It persists in the way you move through your home afterward, in the compulsion to check spaces you once took for granted, in the sounds you can never quite trust again. The house remembers, and so do you. Our first story takes us to a farm in rural Germany, to the winter of 1922, to a family that heard footsteps in their attic and found prints in the snow leading toward their house but never away. It is a story that has been told many times, but never quite like this, softly, slowly, with attention to the quiet details that haunt more effectively than any scream. It is the story of Hinterkaifeck, where someone was living in the spaces between, and where that presence led to one of Germany's most enduring mysteries. But before we walk up that snowy path to the farmhouse, before we enter those rooms where shadows moved with their own logic, take a breath. Settle deeper into comfort. Let the world around you fade to something distant and soft. What follows is strange, but you are safe. What follows is unsettling, but you are far from harm. These are only stories, only whispers from the past, only reminders that our homes, all homes, contain more than we can see, and sometimes that something more is watching back. Chapter 1. Rooms with someone inside. There is something about an attic that invites secrecy. Perhaps it is the way they exist above the ordinary flow of life, removed from the daily rhythms of cooking and cleaning and conversation. Perhaps it is their association with storage, boxes of forgotten things, old furniture waiting to be remembered, objects that once mattered but no longer fit into the narrative we tell about ourselves. Or perhaps it is simply their darkness, the way light fails to reach their corners even on the brightest days. Attics occupy a liminal space in our architecture and our imagination. They are part of the home but separate from it, accessible but rarely accessed, known but not quite familiar. We climb into them when necessity demands, to retrieve holiday decorations, to investigate a roof leak, to store away one more thing we cannot bring ourselves to discard. But we don't stay. Something about them discourages lingering. The air is different up there, stale and still, thick with dust and the accumulated breath of decades. Temperature extremes make them uncomfortable. Too hot in summer, too cold in winter. They are spaces designed for objects, not people, yet people hide there anyway. Crawl spaces occupy a different kind of liminality. Where attics float above, crawl spaces press below, creating a thin barrier between the life of the home and the earth beneath. They are even less hospitable than attics, low-ceilinged, often damp, populated by spiders and the occasional rodent. Their very name suggests discomfort, the need to move on hands and knees through darkness, to make yourself small and uncomfortable to navigate their confines. Most crawl spaces have a single access point, a small door or hatch that opens reluctantly, releasing a breath of earth and mould. We peer into them with flashlights when problems arise, checking for foundation cracks, looking for the source of strange odours, ensuring that pipes haven't frozen or burst. These inspections are brief, motivated entirely by necessity. No one chooses to spend time in a crawl space, except when they do. Between the attic above and the crawl space below lies the inhabited space of the house, the rooms where we live our visible lives. But even these rooms contain their own hidden hollows. Walls are not solid but hollow, containing the infrastructure of modern life, wires that carry electricity, pipes that carry water, insulation that traps air to keep us warm or cool. In older homes, these wall cavities can be surprisingly large, the space between studs wide enough to accommodate more than just utilities. In apartments, the space between units creates another kind of void, a buffer zone that belongs to no one and everyone. These are the places we never think about, the negative spaces that make our positive spaces possible, and it is precisely because we never think about them that they become ideal hiding places for those who wish to remain unseen. The psychology of the hidden intruder has been studied, though never fully understood. Mental health professionals have offered theories: extreme social anxiety, paranoid delusions, the breakdown of normal boundaries between self and other. Some speak of attachment disorders taken to their most disturbing extreme, the desire for human connection twisted into something that can only express itself through secret proximity. But theories feel inadequate when confronted with the actual cases. How do you explain someone who chooses to live in a closet for months, emerging only when they believe the home's occupants are asleep? How do you account for the patience required to remain absolutely still for hours at a time, barely breathing, while life continues just beyond a thin door? Some have wondered if it creates a kind of intimacy, this one-sided witnessing of another's life. The hidden intruder knows things no one else knows. The morning routines, the evening arguments, the moments of vulnerability when masks drop and the private self emerges. They become unwilling repositories of secrets, invisible confidants to confessions never meant to be heard. Perhaps this knowledge creates an illusion of relationship, a sense of being connected to the people whose lives they observe from the shadows. Or perhaps it is something simpler and sadder, just the basic human need for shelter, taken to the only conclusion available to someone who has exhausted all other options. In Japan, there is a term for people who hide in others' homes, nozoki, or watcher. The word carries connotations of voyeurism, but it also suggests something more passive, the act of witnessing without interfering. Japanese urban folklore contains numerous stories of such watchers, people who make their homes in the unused spaces of modern apartments, surviving on stolen food and the occasional mercy of architectural design. One story, documented in 2008, tells of a woman who lived in a man's closet for a full year before being discovered. She had entered through an unlocked door while he was away, found the closet and simply stayed. She was careful, emerging only to use the bathroom and take small amounts of food that might not be missed. She showered when she heard him leave for work, always ensuring she left no trace of her presence. It was only when the man installed security cameras, concerned about his mysteriously disappearing groceries, that her existence came to light. The footage showed her moving through his apartment with the ease of long familiarity, navigating in darkness, opening cabinets and refrigerators with the confidence of someone who had mapped every inch of the space. When police removed her from the closet, she was calm, almost serene. She had been homeless, she explained, and the closet was warm and safe. She meant no harm. She simply needed a place to be. But not all hidden intruders are so benign in their intentions or their impact. Some cases suggest a more predatory motive, the hiding serving not just as shelter, but as vantage point. The better to observe, to plan, to wait for the right moment to make their presence known in more violent ways. The The line between desperate refuge and dangerous surveillance can be difficult to determine, sometimes impossible until tragedy makes it clear. This ambiguity haunts the famous cases, the ones that end in discovery rather than violence. Were these hidden people simply trying to survive, or were they building towards something darker? The answer often depends on interpretation, on whether we choose to see their concealment as protective or predatory. The 3 stories we will explore tonight exist at different points along this spectrum of intention and harm. In Bavaria, a family heard footsteps in their attic, found tracks in the snow, and sensed a presence they could not locate or explain. Whether someone was truly living above them remains uncertain, but the family died violently, and their killer moved through the house for days afterward as if claiming territory that had always been theirs. In Denver, a man heard sounds from his crawl space and discovered another man living there, existing in the narrow gap between floor and earth, warm from the heat that rose through the floorboards, sustained by stolen food and water, present but invisible for longer than anyone could believe possible. In Osaka, a woman vanished into the unused storage space of a man's apartment, making herself so small and quiet that she became part of the architecture itself, a hidden fixture that breathed and ate and watched but never revealed itself until technology forced her into visibility. Each case raises questions that resist simple answers. What drives someone to choose concealment over all other options? How does one survive in spaces designed to be uninhabitable? What happens to the mind during days, weeks, months of enforced stillness and silence? And what does it do to those who discover they were never alone, that their privacy was always an illusion, that someone was there in the darkness watching, waiting, existing just beyond the threshold of their awareness? These questions don't have comfortable answers. Perhaps they have no answers at all, only the disquieting reality that our homes, these places we trust absolutely, contain spaces we cannot fully control or even fully comprehend. There is an old saying that good fences make good neighbours. The implication is that boundaries create respect, that separation allows for peaceful coexistence. But what happens when the boundary is violated, when the fence is breached not through dramatic confrontation but through patient, invisible transgression? The hidden intruder operates in a space beyond traditional trespass. They do not break down doors or shatter windows. They do not announce themselves or make demands. Instead, they slip through gaps, exploit unlocked access points, find the places where vigilance lapses and security depends on the assumption that no one would ever choose to hide in such uncomfortable, undignified spaces. It is this assumption, that no rational person would live in an attic, a crawl space, a closet, that allows them to remain hidden. We do not look because we cannot imagine anyone would be there to find. But they are there, or they have been, or they might be still, in houses where the signs have not yet accumulated to the point of forcing investigation, where the sounds are dismissed as the building settling, where the missing food is attributed to faulty memory, where the sense of being watched is rationalized away as paranoia or imagination. How many hidden intruders are never discovered? How many move through the negative spaces of our homes, ghost-like but corporeal, present but unseen, until they choose to leave or until some accident of circumstance reveals them? The documented cases, the ones that make it into police reports and news articles and eventually into stories like this, may represent only a fraction of the actual occurrences. The thought is uncomfortable, which is perhaps why we prefer not to think it. Tonight, though, we will think it. We will enter those uncomfortable spaces in our imagination, guided by the documented cases that prove such things are not only possible, but have actually happened. We will move slowly through the details, pausing to consider what it might feel like to be the hidden one, and what it must feel like to discover you were never as alone as you believed. The first of our 3 stories takes us to a farm that no longer exists, to a family that heard sounds from above, to footprints in snow that led only inward, never outward. It is a story wrapped in mystery and speculation, a case that remains unsolved more than a century after it unfolded. But at its heart lies a simple, terrible possibility that someone was living in the spaces between, and that the family below paid the ultimate price for sharing their home with an uninvited presence. The farm was called Hinterkaifeck, and what happened there in the spring of 1922 has haunted those who study such things ever since. Chapter 2: The Footsteps at Hinterkaifeck. The farm at Hinterkaifeck sat isolated in the Bavarian countryside several kilometres from the nearest village of Kaifeck. It was not the kind of place where neighbours dropped by unannounced, not the kind of setting where help could arrive quickly if needed. The family who lived there, the Grubers, occupied their own small world, bounded by fields and forest, by the rhythm of agricultural life, by the seasons that dictated when to plant and when to harvest. In March of 1922, that world began to tilt towards something wrong. Andreas Gruber was 63 years old, a farmer who had spent his entire life working the land around Hinterkaifeck. He lived there with his wife Cecilia, their widowed daughter Victoria, and Victoria's 2 children, 7-year-old Cecilia, called Chili, and 2-year-old Joseph. A maid named Maria Baumgartner also lived on the farm, having arrived just 6 months earlier to help with household tasks. It was a configuration common to rural farms of that era, multiple generations under one roof, working together to sustain themselves from the land. The house itself was modest, a traditional Bavarian farmhouse with living quarters on one side and a barn on the other, connected by a shared structure that allowed the family to care for animals without venturing into winter cold. Above the living quarters was an attic, used for storage as all attics are, but also as a buffer against the elements, a space of air that helped insulate the rooms below. It was from this attic that the sounds came. Andreas first mentioned the noises to his neighbours in late March, perhaps a week before the family was killed. He described footsteps, the distinct sound of someone walking across the floorboards above the living areas. They came at night mostly, when the family was settling down to sleep, though sometimes they occurred during the day as well. At first, Andreas had attributed the sounds to the house itself, to the natural expansion and contraction of wood, to wind moving through gaps in the roof. Old houses speak, after all, developing their own vocabularies of creaks and groans. But these sounds were different. They had rhythm, cadence, the unmistakable pattern of bipedal movement. They sounded, in other words, like footsteps. Andreas investigated, of course. He climbed the narrow stairs to the attic and searched among the stored items. Old furniture, farming equipment, boxes of things accumulated over decades. He found nothing out of place, no evidence that anyone had disturbed the dust or moved through that space. The attic appeared exactly as it always had, still and silent and empty of human presence. Yet the sounds continued, and some nights they were so distinct that Andreas would wake his wife, asking her to listen, to confirm that he wasn't imagining things. She heard them too, or said she did, though she seemed less concerned than her husband. Old houses make noises, she might have reasoned. There's nothing to fear from empty rooms. But Andreas became increasingly uneasy. Then came the footprints in the snow. This detail, more than any other, has fueled speculation about a hidden intruder living at Hinterkaifeck in the days before the murders. Andreas discovered the tracks one morning, leading from the forest edge across the open field toward the farmhouse. They were clear and deliberate, the prints of an adult walking with purpose through the snow. What made them unsettling was not their presence, but their direction. They led to the house, but never away from it. Andreas followed them as far as the farm buildings, where they seemed to terminate near one of the entrances, but he could find no corresponding set of tracks leading back toward the forest, no evidence that whoever made them had left. The implication was clear and impossible. Someone had walked to the farm and remained there, or had somehow departed without leaving any trace of their exit. Andreas showed the tracks to Victoria and mentioned them to neighbours when he encountered them at the village market. He tried to make light of it, presenting the mystery as a curiosity rather than a concern, but those who spoke with him remembered an undercurrent of worry in his manner. Something about the tracks bothered him more than he wanted to admit. He investigated the outbuildings, the barn, the storage areas, anywhere someone might have gone to escape notice. He found nothing, or at least nothing he mentioned to anyone else. The snow eventually melted, taking the tracks with it, and the mystery remained unresolved, but the footsteps in the attic persisted. Other strange occurrences accumulated during those final days. A set of house keys went missing, the ones that Andreas normally kept on a hook near the door. He searched for them but never found them, eventually having to use a spare set. The missing keys troubled him, though he told himself they had probably been misplaced, dropped somewhere in the house, or lost during work in the fields. But keys don't misplace themselves. Someone has to move them. There was also the matter of the newspaper. The family subscribed to a local paper that was delivered every few days. Andreas claimed that on one occasion he found the paper already opened and partially read, despite no one in the family admitting to having looked at it. The pages were slightly disarranged, creased in ways that suggested handling, as if someone had sat down with it, and spent time going through the articles. This detail is harder to verify than the others, reported second-hand and subject to the unreliability of memory and hearsay. But it fits the pattern: small disturbances, minor violations of the expected order of things, signs that something or someone was interfering with the normal flow of household life. The maid, Maria Baumgartner, may have been the most frightened of all. She had only worked at Hinterkaifeck for 6 months, replacing a previous maid who had left abruptly, claiming the house frightened her. That earlier maid had spoken of strange sounds, of feeling watched, of a general unease that made it impossible for her to stay. Maria apparently shared these concerns but felt she had no choice but to remain. She needed the work, needed the wages, needed the room and board that came with the position. But neighbours who encountered her in the village during her time at the farm remembered her as nervous, jumpy, constantly looking over her shoulder as if expecting something to emerge from behind her. She confided in at least one person that she heard noises in the night, sounds that seemed to come from above her small room on the ground floor. She described a feeling of being observed, though she could never identify the source of her discomfort. The house felt wrong to her, she said, though she couldn't articulate exactly what made it feel that way. It simply felt wrong. On the evening of March 31st, 1922, something moved through the spaces of Hinterkaifeck with lethal intent. The family was killed systematically, methodically, with what investigators would later describe as a mattock, a farming tool, heavy and brutal, designed for breaking earth but equally effective at breaking skulls. Andreas and Cecilia were attacked first, lured one by one to the barn under some pretense, struck down before they could cry out or flee. Their bodies fell among the hay and farming equipment, hidden from casual view. And then the killer moved to the house. Victoria was killed in her room, along with young Cecilia, the 7-year-old daughter who may have woken to see the horror descending on her family. Maria Baumgartner died in her small chamber, possibly never fully understanding what was happening. 2-year-old Joseph was killed last, struck down in his crib, too young to comprehend the violence that had swept through his home. 6 people dead in a matter of minutes or perhaps hours. The timeline has never been fully established. What happened next is almost as disturbing as the murders themselves. The killer did not flee immediately after the violence. Instead, evidence suggests they remained at the farm for several days, living among the bodies, moving through the rooms as if they owned them. Neighbours noticed smoke rising from the farmhouse chimney in the days after the killings, proof that fires were being lit, that someone was keeping warm. The livestock were fed and cared for, suggesting the killer knew enough about farm routines to maintain appearances. Food was prepared in the kitchen, dishes used and washed, a surreal domesticity overlaying the carnage hidden in other rooms. It was as if the killer had been waiting for this moment, had perhaps been living in the margins of the farm for some time, learning its rhythms, understanding its patterns, and when the family was gone, simply stepped into the void they left behind. The bodies were discovered on April 4th, when neighbours finally grew concerned about the family's absence. No one had seen any of them for days, unusual for a working farm where someone always needed to go to the village for supplies or to conduct business. When the neighbours entered the property, they found the horror that had been hidden there. The investigation that followed was hampered by the chaos of the era. Germany in 1922 was still reeling from the First World War. Institutions were strained, resources were limited. The police did their best, but forensic science was primitive, and the crime scene had been contaminated by the killer's continued presence, by their movement through the spaces, by the days that passed before discovery. Suspects were questioned, theories proposed, but nothing conclusive emerged. The case file grew thick with speculation and dead ends. Eventually it went cold, joining the ranks of unsolved mysteries that haunt the historical record. Over the decades, investigators and amateur detectives have proposed numerous theories about who killed the Gruber family and why. Some pointed to family drama, Victoria's complicated relationships, rumours of incest, financial disputes that might have motivated revenge. Others suggested a drifter, someone passing through who saw opportunity in the isolated farm. Still others believed it was someone from the village, someone who knew the family well enough to understand their routines and vulnerabilities. But the detail that lingers, the one that connects Hinterkaifeck to our larger story of hidden intruders, is the possibility that someone was living there all along. That the footsteps Andreas heard were real, that the tracks in the snow led to someone who never left, that the unseen presence the family sensed was not paranoia or imagination, but accurate perception of a terrible truth. Perhaps someone had been occupying the attic, living in that space above the family, emerging at night to move through the house when everyone slept, taking food, reading newspapers, existing in the negative spaces while learning the patterns of those below. And when the moment came, whether through discovery, confrontation, or some internal trigger we can never understand, they descended from their hiding place and ended the lives of everyone who shared that space. This theory has never been proven, but it has never been fully dismissed either. It fits the evidence as well as any other explanation, perhaps better than most. The killer's familiarity with the farm layout, their comfort remaining there for days afterward, their knowledge of when and how to strike, all of this suggests someone who had spent time observing, learning, waiting. And what better vantage point than the attic, that space above where footsteps echoed and no one thought to look, because no rational person would choose to live there. The forensic team that examined the scene noted something peculiar about the attic. There were areas where the dust had been disturbed, places where something, or someone, might have rested or moved, but the disturbance was old, impossible to date with any precision, and could have been caused by any number of innocent activities over the years. Still, some investigators felt the attic held secrets it would not reveal. The space felt inhabited in a way that went beyond the stored objects and accumulated belongings. It felt, one officer wrote in his notes, like a place where someone had spent time, had perhaps even slept, had certainly observed the household below through gaps in the floorboards. But without more concrete evidence, the attic theory remained just that. A theory, one possibility among many, impossible to prove or disprove with the tools available at the time. The farmhouse at Hinterkaifeck no longer exists. It was torn down in the years after the murders, the land eventually absorbed into other properties, the buildings erased as if removing them could erase the memory of what happened there. But the story persists, told and retold, each telling adding new details or stripping away old ones, until it becomes difficult to separate fact from legend, history from speculation. What remains certain is this: a family heard sounds they could not explain, found evidence of intrusion they could not account for, and died violently in the home they thought was theirs alone. Whether someone was living in their attic or simply waiting nearby for an opportunity to strike, the result was the same. Their sanctuary became a tomb, their privacy was an illusion, and whatever presence moved through those rooms in their final days moved with knowledge and purpose. There is something uniquely terrifying about the idea of being watched in your own home, of having your most private moments observed by unseen eyes. We accept surveillance in public spaces, cameras on street corners, in stores, in parking lots, because we understand that public life involves a surrender of privacy. But the home is different. The home is supposed to be the place where we can be completely ourselves, where we need not perform or pretend, where privacy is absolute. The hidden intruder violates this fundamental expectation. They turn the home into a stage without the inhabitants' knowledge or consent. Every moment becomes a performance for an audience of one, every word potentially overheard, every action potentially observed. And because the observation is secret, because the inhabitants don't know they're being watched, they continue living as they always have, vulnerable, exposed, trusting in the privacy that no longer exists. If someone was indeed living in the Hinterkaifeck attic, what did they think as they listened to the family below? Did they hear Andreas discussing the strange footsteps, speculating about their origin, wondering if someone was hiding nearby? Did they hear the concern in his voice, the fear he tried to suppress, the growing certainty that something was wrong? Did they hear Maria Baumgartner confiding her unease, speaking of feeling watched, describing the wrongness she sensed but couldn't name? Did they hear little Cecilia asking questions about the noises, wondering if there were ghosts in the house, creating childhood explanations for adult anxieties? And if they heard all this, what did they feel? Amusement at the family's proximity to the truth, fear that discovery was imminent, or perhaps nothing at all, their humanity eroded by days and weeks of hiding, their emotional responses dulled by the constant necessity of silence and stillness? We cannot know. The person who might have answered these questions, if they existed at all, disappeared into history without leaving a name or confession. The attic at Hinterkaifeck remembers, even if the attic itself is gone. The memory lives in the story, in the whisper of footsteps overhead, in the tracks that led inward but never outward, in the house keys that vanished and were never found. It lives in the newspaper that someone read without permission, in Maria Baumgartner's intuition that something was terribly wrong, in Andreas Gruber's final days of mounting unease. Some spaces hold what happens within them long after the walls have fallen. The violence at Hinterkaifeck was so profound, the mystery so enduring, that the farm has become a kind of landmark in the geography of unsolved crimes. People still visit the location, though there's nothing to see but fields and forest, the ordinary landscape of rural Bavaria. They come because the story refuses to release them, because somewhere in the telling is a truth we recognize even if we cannot articulate it, that our homes are not as secure as we believe, that the spaces above and below and beside us may contain more than emptiness, that sometimes the sounds we hear in the night are exactly what they seem to be. Footsteps. Real and present and impossibly close. Chapter 3. Shadows in the Denver crawlspace. There are cities where winter presses down with particular weight, where cold becomes a physical presence that drives people indoors, into any shelter they can find. Denver is such a city, sitting at the edge of the mountains, exposed to winds that sweep down from higher elevations carrying ice and the promise of snow. In a city like this, warmth becomes survival. Those with homes retreat behind closed doors and drawn curtains, turning up thermostats, layering blankets, grateful for walls and roofs that keep the cold at bay. Those without homes make different calculations, seeking heat wherever it can be found, in shelters if space is available, in doorways and parking garages if it is not, in the forgotten spaces of the city where warmth rises from below or leaks from aging infrastructure. Sometimes warmth leads people to places they were never meant to be. The house on the quiet Denver street was unremarkable in every way that mattered to its neighbours. A single-story structure built in the 1950s, it had the modest charm of post-war American architecture, simple lines, functional design, a small yard enclosed by a chain-link fence. The man who lived there had owned it for several years, maintaining it well enough to avoid the notice that comes with neglect. He lived alone, worked a regular job, kept to himself in the way that urban dwellers often do, friendly enough in passing but not seeking deeper connection with those who lived nearby. His life followed predictable patterns, leaving for work in the morning, returning in the evening, the lights in his windows tracking his movement through rooms in ways that suggested nothing unusual, nothing wrong. But beneath his floors, in the crawl space that separated his home from the earth, another life was unfolding in parallel. The crawl space was typical of houses from that era, about 3 feet high, accessible through a small hatch in the floor of a closet, its dirt floor covered with a thin plastic vapor barrier to keep moisture from rising into the living areas above. Pipes ran through it, carrying water to bathrooms and kitchen. Electrical conduits snaked along the underside of the floor joists. Insulation hung in ragged strips between the structural beams, yellowed with age and sagging from decades of fighting gravity. It was not a place designed for human occupation. The ceiling was too low for standing, the air too stale for comfort, the darkness too complete for anyone without a flashlight to navigate safely. It smelled of earth and mould, and the faint chemical tang of the plastic barrier. Spiders made their homes in the corners where joists met foundation walls. Occasionally mice would find their way in through gaps in the foundation, seeking their own shelter from the cold. But in the winter of 2013, something larger than a mouse was living there. The homeowner first noticed the sounds in late November, as temperatures began their seasonal descent toward freezing. They were subtle at first, easy to dismiss, creaks and groans that could be explained by the house adjusting to temperature changes, by the expansion and contraction of materials responding to the cold. But gradually the sounds took on character that made them harder to ignore. They came at irregular intervals, sometimes during the day, but more often at night. They seemed to move, originating from different parts of the house at different times, as if something was travelling beneath the floors, navigating the crawl space from one end of the structure to the other. The homeowner mentioned it to friends, describing the noises in the vague terms we use when we're not quite ready to admit what we suspect. Something in the crawl space, he said. Probably an animal, maybe a raccoon or a stray cat that had found a way in and was taking advantage of the relative warmth rising through the floorboards. His friends agreed this was likely, offering the reassurance we all seek when faced with the unexplained, a rational explanation that allows us to return to our comfortable assumptions about how the world works. But the sounds continued, and they were joined by other disturbances. Food began disappearing from the kitchen with enough regularity that the homeowner could no longer attribute it to faulty memory or midnight snacking he didn't recall. At first, it was small things. A few slices of bread, some fruit, a partial container of leftovers that should have lasted another day or two. The kind of losses that are easy to rationalize, easy to dismiss. Then the disappearances became more obvious. An entire package of lunch meat vanished overnight. A loaf of bread he'd bought just that afternoon was gone by morning. Bottles of water, cans of soup, boxes of crackers, all disappearing at a rate that couldn't be explained by his own consumption. He began to feel uneasy in his own home, experiencing that peculiar sensation of being watched that has no rational basis, but feels nonetheless real. The feeling was strongest at night, when he was settling down to sleep, when the house was quiet and every sound seemed amplified by darkness and stillness. Sometimes he would lie awake, listening, trying to identify the source of his discomfort. And sometimes, in that half-state between waking and sleeping, he would hear them, sounds from below, faint but distinct, the whisper of movement in spaces where nothing should move. It was the cold that finally drove him to investigate. December brought temperatures that dropped below zero at night, the kind of cold that finds every gap and crack in a house's defences, that turns homes into battlegrounds between interior warmth and exterior ice. His heating bills climbed higher than they should have, suggesting heat was escaping somewhere, bleeding out into spaces where it did no good. He checked the obvious culprits, windows, doors, the seals around the foundation, but found nothing that would account for the heat loss. That's when he decided to check the crawl space, thinking perhaps insulation had fallen or been damaged by whatever animal he suspected was living down there. He opened the closet that contained the access hatch, moved aside the boxes and hanging clothes that normally obscured it, and pulled up the wooden panel that covered the opening. Warm air rose from below, carrying with it a smell that stopped him immediately. It was not the smell of earth or mould, or even animal presence. It was distinctly human. The odour of unwashed bodies, of waste, of air that had been breathed and rebreathed in a confined space. It was the smell of habitation, of life being lived in conditions that degraded it to its most basic biological functions. The homeowner stood frozen at the opening, his flashlight pointed down into darkness, his mind struggling to process what his senses were telling him. Someone was living in his crawl space. Not an animal, not a raccoon or stray cat, but a person. A human being had been existing beneath his floors for weeks, possibly months, close enough that mere inches of wood and insulation separated them. He should have closed the hatch immediately, should have called the police without investigating further. But shock and disbelief drove him to confirm what seemed impossible. He lowered himself part-way into the opening, angling the flashlight beam to sweep through the crawl space. The light caught on objects that didn't belong. A sleeping bag, crumpled and dirty, spread across the plastic vapour barrier. Empty food containers, water bottles, the detritus of survival arranged in a rough approximation of a living space. And there, pressed against the far wall in an attempt to hide from the light, a man. Later, in police reports and news articles, he would be described as homeless, as someone who'd been living on the streets before finding his way into the crawl space. He was in his 30s, dishevelled and thin, his clothes layered against cold that was only partially mitigated by the heat rising through the floorboards above. When the police removed him from the crawl space, he offered little explanation for his presence there. He had been cold, he said. He had found the access hatch unlocked during a previous visit when the homeowner was away, had discovered the crawl space, and decided it was warmer than sleeping on the street. He had intended to stay just one night, but one night became 2, then a week, then longer. The heat from the house above made the crawl space almost comfortable by comparison to the frozen streets. He could hear the homeowner moving around, could track his routines, could tell when he left for work and when he returned, when he was awake and when he slept. During the day, while the homeowner was away, he would emerge from the hatch, moving carefully through the house, taking food and water, using the bathroom, gathering supplies before retreating back below. He meant no harm, he insisted. He was just trying to survive the winter. The police asked how long he had been living there. He wasn't certain. Time loses its structure when you're living in darkness, when day and night are marked only by the sounds of someone else's life above you. Several weeks at least, possibly 2 months. Long enough that the crawl space had become familiar territory, that he knew which areas provided the most warmth, where pipes ran that would hiss and clang when the homeowner used water, where the floor joists were strongest and where they sagged enough that dust would rain down when someone walked directly above. He had become, in his own strange way, intimately familiar with the house. He knew its sounds, its patterns, its daily rhythms. He knew when the homeowner woke up, what he ate for breakfast, what time he left for work, and what time he typically returned. He knew the man's habits without ever having spoken to him, knew details of his life that no stranger should know. This knowledge created a strange intimacy, he explained to the officers who interviewed him. He felt connected to the homeowner in a way that was difficult to articulate, as if they were sharing the space even though only one of them knew about the sharing. The homeowner, for his part, felt violated in ways that went beyond simple trespass. Someone had been living beneath him, listening to his movements, observing his patterns, existing in his blind spot for weeks or months. Every moment he had thought he was alone, he had actually been sharing his space with an uninvited presence. He thought about all the times he had moved through his house in states of undress, all the private phone conversations he'd conducted, all the vulnerable moments when he thought no one could see or hear. And all that time, just beneath his feet, someone had been there, listening, learning, becoming familiar with the most intimate details of his daily existence. The violation was profound and lasting. Even after the intruder was removed, even after the crawl space was cleaned and the hatch secured with a lock, the homeowner couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He would lie awake at night listening for sounds from below, unable to trust the silence. He moved through his house differently, aware of the spaces above and below him in ways he'd never been before. Eventually he sold the house and moved to an apartment building, choosing a unit on an upper floor where nothing existed below but another person's living space, where the architecture itself prevented the kind of hidden occupation that had turned his home into something he could no longer trust. The Denver case is not unique, though each instance of a hidden intruder carries its own specific details, its own particular horror. Similar stories have emerged from cities across the country, people living in attics and crawl spaces in the unused corners of homes and apartment buildings, sustained by stolen food and the warmth they can steal from those who don't know they're there. What drives someone to choose this existence remains a question without comfortable answers. Desperation certainly plays a role, the basic human need for shelter, overwhelming social prohibitions against trespass and invasion. In cities where homelessness is endemic and shelter space insufficient, the hidden spaces of homes become tempting refuges, places where warmth and relative safety can be found if one is willing to accept the discomfort and danger of concealment. But there seems to be something else at work as well, something harder to articulate. The hidden intruder chooses a particular kind of proximity, one that brings them close to the rhythms of normal life without allowing them to participate in it. They become witnesses to domesticity, observers of the ordinary patterns of eating and sleeping and moving through space that define human existence at its most basic level. Perhaps this observation provides its own kind of warmth, a psychological comfort to accompany the physical warmth rising through the floorboards. Perhaps being near to normal life, even from below or above or behind walls, feels less lonely than being completely isolated on cold streets. Or perhaps it is simply that humans are adaptable creatures, capable of finding ways to survive in conditions that seem impossible, and the crawl space is merely another adaptation to circumstances that leave few other options. After the Denver incident became public, other homeowners came forward with similar experiences. A woman in Seattle discovered someone living in her attic, accessing her home through a gap in the roof while she was at work. A family in Portland found evidence that someone had been staying in their garage, sleeping among stored boxes and leaving only when they heard the family stirring in the adjacent house. A man in Chicago realized that sounds he attributed to pipes were actually someone moving through the walls of his apartment building, navigating the spaces between units like a rat in a maze. Each story followed similar patterns, small disturbances that accumulated until they could no longer be ignored, a growing sense of unease that something was wrong, and finally the shocking discovery that their private spaces were not as private as they believed. And in each case, the homeowners described feeling changed by the experience, unable to return to the easy trust they had once felt in their own homes. The knowledge that someone could hide in plain sight, existing in the negative spaces of their dwellings, transformed the way they moved through and thought about their living spaces. The man from the Denver crawl space was charged with trespassing and theft, minor crimes given the circumstance. He spent a brief time in jail, was connected with social services upon his release, and disappeared into the anonymity that swallows so many who exist at the margins of society. Whether he found stable housing or returned to living on the streets, or perhaps found another crawl space in another unsuspecting person's home, this remains unknown. The systems designed to help are overwhelmed and imperfect, and people fall through the cracks, both literal and metaphorical, with dispiriting regularity. What lingers is not the man himself, but what he represents. The uncomfortable truth that our homes contain spaces we cannot fully control, that warmth and shelter draw those who lack them, and that the boundaries between private and invaded are more porous than our sense of security requires us to believe. The crawl space remains, in houses across cities where cold drives people to desperate measures. And sometimes, when homeowners hear sounds from below, when they notice food disappearing or feel the peculiar certainty of being watched, they are not imagining things. Sometimes there really is someone there, living in the spaces between, existing in the shadows that every structure creates simply by being built. Chapter 4. The Woman Hidden in Osaka. Japan's cities are dense in ways that Western urban centres rarely achieve. Buildings pressed close together, apartments stacked in towers that rise toward narrow strips of sky. In Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, millions live in spaces that would seem impossibly small to those accustomed to sprawl, rooms measured in tatami mats rather than square feet, efficiency prized above all other architectural values. This density creates a particular kind of anonymity. You can live surrounded by hundreds of people and never know their names, never speak to them beyond the most basic courtesies, never develop relationships that go deeper than the polite distance that urban proximity requires. Your neighbours are sounds through thin walls, shadows passing in hallways, presences felt but not truly known. In such conditions, it becomes possible to be invisible even when you are close enough to touch. The man who lived in the small apartment in Osaka was 57 years old, unmarried, employed in an office job that required neither distinction nor failure, just steady competence and regular attendance. His apartment was typical for a single occupant in that part of the city. One room that served multiple functions, a tiny kitchen barely large enough for one person to turn around in, a bathroom with fixtures arranged with geometric efficiency to maximize the limited space. There was also a closet, shallow but wide, with sliding doors that ran the length of one wall. He used it as most people use closets, storing clothes and bedding, boxes of things that didn't have other obvious homes, the accumulated possessions that mark a life lived in one place for an extended period. He had lived in this apartment for 3 years, following patterns that rarely varied. He left each morning at the same time, walking to the train station, commuting to an office where he performed tasks that would be difficult to describe as either important or meaningless. They were simply work, the way most work is, necessary for the functioning of systems larger than any individual contribution. He returned each evening around the same time, stopping occasionally at the konbini for food, eating simple meals while watching television, then sleeping until his alarm signalled the start of another identical day. It was a life that could be described as lonely or peaceful depending on your perspective, isolated or independent, sad or serene. He seemed content with it, or at least resigned to it, which in practical terms amounts to much the same thing. He didn't know that for the past year he had not been living alone. The first indication that something was wrong came in the form of missing food. Not large amounts, not entire meals disappearing, but the slow attrition of supplies that didn't quite match his memory of what he had purchased and when. Rice vanished from the cooker in quantities he couldn't account for. Vegetables he was certain he had bought disappeared before he could use them. The milk carton would be empty days earlier than it should have been. Small things, easily rationalized, the kind of discrepancies that everyone experiences and attributes to faulty memory or miscalculation. But they accumulated with enough consistency that he began to pay closer attention, making mental notes of what he bought and when he used it, trying to track the disappearances with more precision. The pattern persisted, confirming that something was taking his food beyond his own consumption. He considered the obvious possibilities. Perhaps he was sleepwalking, eating in the night without remembering it in the morning. Perhaps his memory was failing in ways that should concern him, early signs of cognitive decline that manifested first in these small domestic confusions. But these explanations felt wrong, inadequate to account for the specificity of what was disappearing and when. The food vanished while he was at work, not during the night when sleepwalking might explain it. And his memory seemed fine in all other respects, no other signs of the deterioration that would worry him, if these food mysteries were symptoms of something larger. So he did what many people in his situation might do. He bought a security camera. The camera was small and inexpensive, designed for exactly this purpose, to monitor homes when their occupants were away. He installed it in May of 2008, positioning it to cover the main room of his apartment, the area that included the kitchen and the closet and most of the living space. It was motion-activated, beginning to record whenever movement triggered its sensors, storing the footage on a memory card that he could review when he returned from work. The first few days of footage showed nothing unusual. Just an empty apartment, sunlight moving across the floor as hours passed, the stillness of a space waiting for its occupant to return and give it purpose. Then, on the fourth day, the camera captured something that made him question his own eyes. The closet doors slid open. This happened around noon, several hours after he had left for work in the quiet middle of the day when the apartment should have been completely empty. A woman emerged. She was small and thin, dressed in clothes that looked slept in, her hair dishevelled in a way that suggested she had just woken up. She moved with the confidence of long familiarity, navigating the apartment as if she had every right to be there, as if this were her home as much as his. She went to the kitchen first, opening the refrigerator and taking out food, eating quickly while standing, then drinking water directly from the tap. She used the bathroom, visible in the frame when she left the door open. She moved some of her belongings from the closet, arranging them slightly differently, then returned everything to its place. The entire process took perhaps 20 minutes. Then she slid back into the closet, pulling the doors closed behind her, disappearing as completely as if she had never been there at all. The man watched this footage multiple times, trying to process what he was seeing. A stranger had been living in his closet, hiding among his clothes and stored belongings, emerging when he was away to eat his food and use his facilities, then retreating back into concealment before he returned. How long had she been there? Days? Weeks? The food had been disappearing for months, suggesting her presence had been much longer than he could immediately comprehend. He thought about all the times he had opened that closet, reaching in for clothes, putting things away, standing just inches from where she must have been hiding, curled into whatever small space she could find that wouldn't be disturbed by his routine interactions with his belongings. He thought about sleeping, lying in his bed just feet away from the closet, completely unaware that someone else was in the room, breathing the same air, existing in parallel to his own existence. The violation was so complete, so intimate, that he felt physically ill watching the footage. He called the police immediately, showing them the video evidence, explaining the situation in words that felt inadequate to capture the strangeness and horror of what he had discovered. The officers arrived at his apartment while he was still at work, timing their visit for the afternoon when the woman would likely be active if the pattern held. They waited outside, then entered quietly, moving toward the closet with the careful approach reserved for situations where they don't know what they'll find. When they slid open the closet doors, she was there. She had created a small nest in the back corner, behind hanging clothes and stored boxes, a space barely large enough for her to lie down in. She had a few belongings, extra clothes, some food wrappers, a plastic bottle for water. The space was organized with the efficiency that extreme limitation requires, everything arranged to maximize the minimal area she occupied. She did not resist when the police asked her to come out. She simply gathered her few possessions and emerged from the closet, blinking in the light of the main room, looking small and tired and strangely calm given the circumstances of her discovery. At the police station, she explained her situation with a matter-of-factness that the officers found unsettling. She was 58 years old, had been homeless for several years, living rough on the streets of Osaka until the conditions became unbearable. One day, she had found the man's apartment door unlocked while he was away. She had entered, looked around, seen the closet, and made a decision born of desperation and opportunity. She would stay just for a little while, just until she figured out something better. That had been a year ago, maybe longer. She had lost track of time in the darkness of the closet. She would wait until she heard him leave in the morning, listening to his routine, the sounds of him preparing for work, the door closing and locking behind him. Then she would wait a bit longer, making sure he wasn't coming back for something forgotten, that the departure was real and complete. Only then would she emerge, moving quickly through the apartment, using the bathroom, eating small amounts of food that she hoped wouldn't be noticed, occasionally showering when she judged it safe. She was always careful to leave no trace, to return everything to exactly how she found it, to be invisible in her impact as she was invisible in her presence. Then, before he returned in the evening, she would retreat back into the closet, arranging herself in her small space, remaining absolutely still and silent while he moved through the apartment just feet away. She described this routine without emotion, as if she were explaining any ordinary living arrangement. The closet was warm and dry, she said. It was safer than the streets. She could hear him through the closet doors, could track his movements, could tell when he was watching television, or preparing food, or getting ready for bed. This proximity to normal life, to the sounds of someone cooking, eating, living in ordinary ways, made her feel less alone than she had felt sleeping in parks or under bridges. Even though she never spoke to him, even though he didn't know she existed, she felt a strange connection to his routine, a sense of participating in domestic life, even if only as a hidden observer. The police asked if she had ever considered revealing herself, ever thought about speaking to him or leaving a note or doing anything to make her presence known. She said no, never. That would have ended everything, would have forced her back to the streets, back to the cold and danger and complete isolation. As long as she remained hidden, she could continue in the closet, safe and relatively comfortable, existing in a space that felt more like home than anywhere else available to her. The case became news across Japan, spreading through media outlets with the viral quality that stories of this nature achieve. Strange enough to capture attention, disturbing enough to generate conversation, specific enough in its details to feel real rather than urban legend. People discussed it in offices and homes, imagining what it would feel like to discover such an intrusion, wondering how they would respond, questioning whether they might have missed similar signs in their own living spaces. Some expressed sympathy for the woman, noting the desperation that must drive someone to choose such an existence, the failure of social systems that left her with no better options than hiding in a stranger's closet. Others focused on the violation experienced by the man, the loss of privacy and safety that the discovery represented, the psychological impact of learning you had been watched and observed in your most private moments. Both perspectives held truth, which made the story resist simple moral categorization. The woman was charged with trespassing but faced no serious penalties given her circumstances, and the fact that she had taken only food and utilities, nothing of significant value. She was connected with social services, offered assistance in finding proper housing and support, though whether that assistance translated into stable living conditions remained uncertain in the reports that followed. The man moved to a different apartment, unable to continue living in a space that had been so thoroughly compromised. He gave interviews describing his experience, speaking about the profound unease of knowing someone had been so close for so long without his knowledge. He would lie awake sometimes, he said, thinking about all the moments she must have witnessed through the closet doors, him changing clothes, him speaking on the phone, him simply existing in ways we only feel comfortable existing when we believe we're alone. The loss of that privacy, even retroactively, felt like a kind of theft that couldn't be recovered or compensated. The Osaka case, as it came to be known, joined a catalogue of similar incidents in Japanese urban folklore. Stories of hidden intruders have a particular resonance in Japan's densely populated cities, where the proximity of strangers is a constant fact of life, where thin walls separate households, where privacy is maintained through social convention rather than physical distance. In such environments, the line between near and hidden becomes blurred in ways that don't occur in societies where space is more abundant and isolation more easily achieved. The concept of the nozoki, the watcher, took on new dimensions after the Osaka case became public. It was no longer just a theoretical possibility or an urban legend, but a documented reality, something that had actually happened and could presumably happen again. Hardware stores reported increased sales of closet locks and security cameras. People began checking their storage spaces more carefully, paying attention to signs they might have previously dismissed. Missing food, unexplained sounds, the subtle sense that something in their home felt different. What makes the Osaka case particularly haunting is its duration. A year is a long time to hide in someone's closet, long enough that it becomes less an emergency refuge and more a chosen lifestyle, however constrained and difficult that lifestyle might be. She had spent 365 days in that small space, emerging only when she believed it safe, spending most of her time in darkness and stillness, listening to the life of another person unfolding just beyond the closet doors. What does that do to a person? How does the mind adapt to such extreme limitation, such complete restriction of movement and agency? What thoughts occupied her during those long hours of enforced silence when the only stimulation was the ambient sound of someone else living their life? We cannot fully know, can only imagine the psychological adaptations required to endure such conditions. Perhaps time loses its normal meaning in such circumstances, hours blending into an undifferentiated stretch of waiting and listening. Perhaps the mind finds ways to escape the physical limitations, creating interior worlds that provide the stimulation the exterior situation denies. Or perhaps it is simpler than that. Perhaps survival itself becomes enough, the accomplishment of making it through another day in relative safety and warmth, sufficient reward for the discomfort and confinement. The closet in the Osaka apartment remains, presumably, though with a different occupant now, someone who knows the story and perhaps checks the space more carefully than the previous tenant did. The physical space holds no memory of what occurred there, requires no exorcism or cleansing, is simply an architectural feature like any other closet in any other apartment. But the story remembers, and in remembering it reminds us that the spaces we think we know completely may contain possibilities we have never considered, that the boundaries of our homes are more porous than we imagine, that sometimes the sounds we hear are not the building settling, but something else. Something that breathes and moves and watches from the darkness we assume is empty. The woman in the closet made herself small enough to fit into a space that should have been too small for human habitation. She adapted her body and her needs to the extreme limitations of her hiding place, becoming almost part of the architecture itself, a fixture that blended so completely with its surroundings that it became invisible even when it was always there. This ability to become invisible while remaining present haunts more than any supernatural presence could, because it is real, documented, proven beyond doubt or speculation. It happened, and therefore it could happen again, in any closet, any attic, any crawl space where someone desperate or disturbed enough decides to make their home in the margins of someone else's life. Chapter 5. The Places Where Walls Remember. Architecture creates spaces, but memory gives them meaning. A room is just a volume of air contained by walls until someone lives in it, moves through it, leaves traces of their presence that accumulate into something we recognize as home. These traces are mostly invisible, skin cells that become dust, breath that changes the air's composition, the slight wear patterns on floors where feet travel most frequently. But some traces go deeper, imprinting themselves not in the physical structure but in the psychological relationship we develop with the spaces we occupy. When that relationship is violated, when we discover that our private spaces were never truly private, something fundamental shifts in how we experience the architecture around us. The 3 stories we have explored, Hinterkaifeck, Denver, Osaka, span nearly a century and 3 continents, yet they share essential elements that transcend their specific circumstances. In each case, someone chose to hide in the negative spaces of domestic architecture, to occupy the voids that exist between and around the rooms where visible life unfolds. They chose these spaces not despite their discomfort, but perhaps because of it, understanding that discomfort itself provides a kind of camouflage. We do not look for people in places where people should not reasonably be able to exist. The attic is too hot, too cold, too dusty. The crawl space is too low, too dark, too damp. The closet is too small, too confining, too obviously inadequate for human habitation. These inadequacies become assets when the goal is concealment rather than comfort. There is a particular kind of knowledge that comes from living in hiding, an intimate familiarity with the rhythms and patterns of those you observe without their awareness. The hidden intruder learns things that even close friends and family members might not know, the small rituals that mark the transition from sleep to waking, the private conversations conducted in assumed solitude, the moments of vulnerability when public masks drop, and the authentic self emerges briefly before being covered again. This knowledge creates an asymmetry that cannot be corrected even after discovery. The intruder knows things about their unwitting host that can never be unknown, memories that will persist regardless of what legal or social consequences follow from their revelation. And the host, upon learning of the intrusion, must retroactively recontextualize every moment they thought they experienced alone. That shower, that phone call, that argument, that quiet evening of reading or watching television, all of it potentially observed, all of it transformed from private experience into performance for an audience of one. Psychologists who study trauma recognize a particular category of violation associated with home invasion, distinct from other forms of crime or trespass. The home represents our most fundamental boundary between self and world, the physical manifestation of the psychological need for control over our immediate environment. When that boundary is breached, especially in ways that suggest long-term observation rather than quick theft, the impact extends far beyond the immediate shock of discovery. Victims report persistent hypervigilance, difficulty sleeping, compulsive checking of locks and spaces that previously required no conscious attention. The automatic trust that allows us to move through our homes with ease becomes impossible to maintain. Some find themselves unable to continue living in the violated space, selling homes or breaking leases, seeking new locations that do not carry the psychological weight of hidden observation. Others stay but never quite recover the ease they once felt, moving through familiar rooms with new awareness of all the places someone could hide, all the ways privacy could be compromised without obvious signs. The architecture itself changes after such a discovery, or rather our perception of it changes in ways that make the architecture feel different. Walls that once seemed solid now seem thin, permeable, inadequate to the task of separation they were designed to perform. Ceilings become sources of unease rather than simple structural necessities. Floors no longer feel like foundations, but like barriers that might have someone beneath them, listening, waiting, existing in parallel to your own existence. Closets, those ordinary storage spaces that every home contains, become particularly fraught. Opening them requires a moment of courage that previously would have seemed absurd, a brief confrontation with the possibility that something or someone might be inside, hidden among the clothes and boxes and ordinary accumulations of domestic life. Some victims develop elaborate checking rituals, methodically inspecting every potential hiding space before they can relax, before they can trust that they are truly alone. These rituals can take on an obsessive quality, consuming time and mental energy, yet abandoning them feels impossible because the alternative, not checking, simply trusting, has been proven dangerous by experience. There is also the question of who else might know. In the Osaka case, neighbours in adjacent apartments would have been just feet away, separated by walls thin enough to transmit sound in both directions. Did they hear anything unusual? Did sounds from the violated apartment suggest the presence of more than one occupant? Or did the woman in the closet maintain such complete silence that her existence left no audible trace for anyone to detect? In Denver, the house was a single-family structure, offering more insulation from neighbouring observation. But still, the man in the crawl space must have produced some sounds, must have moved through that confined space in ways that created vibrations or minor disturbances. Did the homeowner's occasional visitors sense anything wrong, notice anything odd, feel the subtle displacement of air that another presence creates even when that presence remains hidden? At Hinterkaifeck, neighbours and delivery people came and went in the days before the murders. If someone was living in the attic observing the family from above, waiting for the right moment to strike, did that presence create any ripples in the ordinary flow of farm life that others might have noticed had they been paying closer attention? We cannot know with certainty, but the questions persist, suggesting that the boundaries between hidden and revealed are more porous than they appear, that sometimes signs exist but go unrecognized because we are not prepared to interpret them correctly. The hidden intruder exists in a state of perpetual tension between the need for invisibility and the basic requirements of human survival. They must eat, but cannot take so much food that its absence becomes obvious. They must eliminate waste, but cannot leave evidence of their biological functions. They must move, but cannot move so much or so loudly that the sounds betray them. This constant negotiation between need and concealment requires extraordinary discipline and patience. A moment of carelessness, a single sound at the wrong time, an item moved and not returned to exactly its original position. Any of these small failures could lead to discovery. The mental strain of maintaining this level of vigilance for days, weeks, months must be immense. Yet some manage it, suppressing normal human impulses toward movement and expression, becoming almost inanimate in their stillness, achieving a kind of suspended animation that allows them to persist in conditions that should be unsustainable. There is a philosophical question embedded in these stories about the nature of presence itself. If someone is in a space but leaves no detectable trace, are they truly present in any meaningful sense? Do they exist as material fact or more as a potential, a possibility that collapses into actuality only at the moment of discovery. The hidden intruder occupies a strange quantum state, simultaneously there and not there, real but unobserved, affecting the environment in subtle ways that accumulate over time but remain individually beneath the threshold of notice. Discovery changes everything retroactively. What was invisible becomes hypervisible. What was potential becomes historical fact. The uncertainty collapses, and suddenly all those moments of almost noticing, all those half-dismissed suspicions, all those small disturbances that were rationalized away, become reconsidered as evidence that should have been heeded. This retroactive recontextualization can be as disturbing as the initial discovery, forcing a re-evaluation of one's own perceptual reliability and judgment. The homes where these intrusions occurred continue to exist, at least most of them. Hinterkaifeck was demolished, its physical presence erased, though its memory persists in the stories we continue to tell. But the Denver house presumably still stands, occupied now by someone who may or may not know its history, who may or may not check the crawlspace with the paranoia that such knowledge would inspire. The Osaka apartment has certainly been re-rented, the closet once again filled with someone's belongings, used in the ordinary way that closets are meant to be used. Does the space remember? Does it carry some imprint of what occurred there, some residual quality that sensitive occupants might detect even without knowing the specific history? Probably not, in any literal sense. Buildings are not conscious, walls do not remember, architecture does not retain emotional traces of the events that unfold within it. Yet people who live in these places after the fact report feelings they struggle to articulate. Vague unease, a sense that something is not quite right, instincts that drive them to check spaces more carefully than they normally would. Whether this represents genuine sensitivity to subtle environmental cues or simply the power of suggestion and story is difficult to determine. There are practical lessons in these stories, advice that security experts offer to those concerned about the possibility of hidden intruders. Install cameras that monitor not just entry points, but also interior spaces. Secure access points to attics, crawl spaces, and other marginal areas with locks rather than simple latches. Pay attention to small discrepancies in food supplies or utility usage. Trust instincts that suggest something is wrong, even when no obvious evidence supports that feeling. These are sensible precautions, reasonable responses to a documented if rare phenomenon. Yet they also represent a kind of surrender, an acknowledgement that perfect security is impossible, that our homes will always contain vulnerabilities that determined or desperate people can exploit. The alternative, living in constant fear, checking every space obsessively, never trusting in the basic integrity of our living environments, is equally untenable, a different kind of violation that comes from within rather than from external intrusion. What emerges from these stories is not a simple moral or a clear lesson, but rather a more complex understanding of the spaces we inhabit and the assumptions we make about privacy, security, and solitude. We live surrounded by negative space, by voids and gaps and hollows that make our positive spaces possible. Most of the time, these spaces remain truly empty, serving only their intended architectural functions. But sometimes, rarely but memorably, they become occupied by presences we never anticipated, transforming the familiar into something strange and unsettling. The homes where these intrusions occurred are not haunted in any supernatural sense. They are haunted by memory, by the knowledge of what occurred within them, by the persistent awareness that the boundaries between private and observed are thinner and more permeable than we generally acknowledge. This kind of haunting is perhaps more powerful than any ghost story because it is grounded in documented reality, in events that actually happened and could theoretically happen again. It reminds us that the monsters are not under the bed but sometimes inside the walls, that the threats to our sanctuary come not from the supernatural but from the all-too-natural desperation or disturbance of other human beings. As we move toward the final reflections on these stories, it is worth considering what they reveal about contemporary life, about the ways we organize our spaces and our relationships, about the invisible people who exist at the margins of our awareness. Homelessness, mental illness, social isolation. These are not abstract problems, but conditions that drive real people to make choices that seem incomprehensible to those who have never faced such circumstances. The hidden intruder is often someone who has fallen through every other safety net, who has exhausted every other option, who sees the crawl space or attic or closet as a last refuge rather than a first choice. This does not excuse the violation, does not make it acceptable or something to be tolerated, but it complicates the narrative, prevents us from reducing these incidents to simple stories of predators and victims, demands that we consider larger systems and failures that create the conditions where such things become possible. The walls remember, if walls could remember, not just the intrusion but also the desperation that preceded it, the human need for shelter and safety that drives people to accept conditions that diminish and constrain them almost beyond recognition of their own humanity. These are uncomfortable truths, easier to avoid than to confront, but they persist in the shadows of these stories, refusing to be dismissed or forgotten, insisting on recognition even when recognition offers no simple solutions or satisfying conclusions. Chapter 6. The Quiet Presence Behind Us. Trust is built slowly and destroyed instantly. We spend years learning that a space is safe, that a routine is reliable, that the walls around us provide genuine protection, rather than just the illusion of it. Then, in a single moment of discovery, all of that accumulated confidence collapses, revealing how fragile the foundation always was. The people who discover hidden intruders in their homes face a particular kind of recovery, one that has no clear timeline or predictable progression. The violation is not a single event but an ongoing revelation, each remembered moment from before the discovery now requiring re-examination through the lens of what is now known. Every shower taken, every conversation held, every vulnerable moment experienced while believing oneself alone, all of it must be reconsidered, reimagined with an invisible witness present. There is a term in psychology for the feeling of being watched, scopophobia, though that typically describes a fear of being looked at in social situations, rather than the specific dread of unseen observation in private spaces. Perhaps there should be a different word for what victims of hidden intruders experience, something that captures both the retroactive horror and the ongoing anxiety that follows discovery. Because the watching, once it has occurred, cannot be unwatched. The memories exist now in someone else's mind, stored away, perhaps recalled occasionally with whatever emotions accompanied the original observation. The victim has no control over these memories, no way to delete or modify them, no recourse except to live with the knowledge that they exist somewhere, preserved in the consciousness of a stranger who saw things never meant to be seen. Some victims describe developing what they call a double consciousness in their own homes after such discoveries. They move through spaces in two modes simultaneously: the immediate present experience of going about their daily routines, and a secondary awareness that evaluates everything from the perspective of a potential hidden observer. Is someone listening to this phone conversation? Could someone see me from that air vent, that gap between floorboards, that crack in the ceiling? Am I ever truly alone? Or is solitude just another illusion I've been accepting without sufficient evidence? This double consciousness is exhausting, consuming mental energy that once went to other tasks, transforming the home from a place of rest into a place of constant vigilance. Eventually, for some, the exhaustion becomes unsustainable and they must choose: either find a way to rebuild trust in their space despite what they now know is possible, or abandon the space entirely for somewhere that does not carry the same psychological weight. The Denver homeowner who found the man in his crawlspace spoke in later interviews about the process of trying to reclaim his sense of safety. He described checking the crawlspace multiple times a day at first, opening the hatch and shining a flashlight into the darkness, confirming again and again that the space was empty. Even after installing a lock on the access hatch, even after the police had thoroughly searched and confirmed no one else was hiding in the house, the compulsion to check remained. His rational mind understood that the intruder was gone, that security measures were in place, that the probability of recurrence was vanishingly small. But rationality could not override the deeper instinct that had been activated by the discovery, the primal awareness that his sanctuary had been compromised and might never be truly secure again. Eventually he sold the house, unable to reconcile his need for peace with the knowledge the space contained. His new apartment, chosen specifically for being on an upper floor with concrete beneath it, rather than a crawl space, offered a fresh start unburdened by traumatic association. But even there, he admitted, he sometimes found himself checking closets and storage areas with more care than most people would consider necessary. The experience had taught him something he could not unlearn, that the world contains possibilities most people never consider, and that once you know those possibilities exist, you cannot return to the comfortable ignorance you once enjoyed. Children who grow up in homes where hidden intruders were discovered sometimes develop different relationships with domestic space than their peers. At Hinterkaifeck, there were no child survivors to carry forward the knowledge of what occurred there, but in other, less violent cases, children have been present and aware during the discovery process. Child psychologists who have worked with such families note that children often internalize the breach of security in ways that manifest later in their development. Some become hypervigilant about locked doors and windows, needing constant reassurance that their home is secure. Others develop anxiety around being alone, the solitude that most children gradually learn to tolerate and even enjoy remaining permanently uncomfortable for them. Still, others seem to process the experience with surprising resilience, incorporating it into their understanding of the world without allowing it to dominate their sense of safety. The difference often lies in how the adults around them respond to the discovery, whether the aftermath is marked by ongoing fear and disruption, or by measured responses that acknowledge the violation while working to restore normalcy. There is also the question of what happens to the intruders after their discovery, how they process the end of their hidden existence, and what paths their lives take once the secret spaces are no longer available to them. Most disappear into the systems designed to address homelessness, mental illness, or criminal behavior, absorbed into institutional frameworks that rarely produce clear outcomes or satisfying resolutions. Follow-up is difficult, privacy laws prevent detailed tracking, and the individuals themselves often resist contact or engagement with researchers or journalists seeking to understand their experiences. What little information exists suggests complex trajectories. Some find stable housing and support, managing to transition back into conventional living situations. Others cycle through temporary shelters and street homelessness, never quite finding the security they briefly achieved in their hidden spaces, however uncomfortable those spaces were. Still others disappear completely from official records, their fates unknown and perhaps unknowable. And some, though this is only suspected rather than documented, may find new hiding places, new homes to infiltrate, new negative spaces to occupy, until discovery or circumstance forces them to move again. The woman from the Osaka closet gave a single interview after her discovery, speaking to a journalist who approached the story with unusual sensitivity and care. In that conversation, she described the year in the closet not with shame or regret, but with a strange kind of nostalgia, as if remembering a difficult but meaningful period of her life. She missed the warmth, she said. She missed the safety of having walls around her, even if those walls belonged to someone else's closet rather than a room of her own. Most of all, she missed the proximity to normal life, the ability to hear someone cooking dinner or watching television, or simply moving through the ordinary rhythms of domestic existence. These sounds, she explained, made her feel less alone than the silence of the streets ever had. Even though she never spoke to the man whose apartment she occupied, even though he remained entirely unaware of her presence for most of that year, she felt a connection to him, a one-sided intimacy that provided comfort in her isolation. The interviewer asked if she understood how her presence had affected him, the violation he experienced upon discovering her. She paused for a long time before answering, and when she did, her words suggested a kind of cognitive dissonance. She could intellectually understand that what she did was wrong, that it caused harm, but emotionally she struggled to reconcile that understanding with her own experience of need and survival. She had needed shelter, she said finally. She had found it in the only place available to her. She regretted causing distress, but she could not regret surviving. This tension between survival and violation runs through all of these stories, complicating any attempt to reduce them to simple narratives of right and wrong. The hidden intruder is simultaneously victim and perpetrator, driven by circumstances beyond their control to make choices that harm others, yet still human, still deserving of some measure of understanding, even as their actions demand accountability. It would be easier if these stories allowed for clear moral categorization, if we could simply condemn the intruders without remainder or sympathy. But the reality resists such simplification, insisting instead that we hold multiple truths in tension, that the violation is real and serious, and that the desperation driving it is also real and serious, and that both of these facts can coexist without either one cancelling out the other. There are broader questions embedded in these individual stories about how we organise society, how we distribute resources, how we care for or fail to care for those who fall outside the boundaries of conventional social participation. Every hidden intruder represents a failure point in the social safety net, a person for whom shelters were full or unavailable, for whom mental health services were inadequate or inaccessible, for whom the ordinary pathways to housing and stability had become impassable. They found their way into crawl spaces and closets and attics, not because these spaces were appealing, but because all other options had been exhausted or eliminated. The hidden space became a last resort, chosen not from preference but from the absence of anything better. Addressing these cases only after discovery, only once the violation has occurred and traumatized those whose homes were infiltrated, represents a kind of societal failure that we rarely acknowledge or examine with sufficient honesty. Prevention would require different systems, different priorities, different allocations of resources and attention. But prevention is harder than response, requires sustained commitment rather than reactive intervention, and so the hidden intruders continue to exist in the margins and negative spaces of our cities, visible only when discovered, otherwise existing in a kind of social invisibility that mirrors their physical concealment. As we near the end of our journey through these stories, it becomes clear that what haunts most powerfully is not any single detail or dramatic moment, but rather the accumulation of small revelations, the footprints that led only inward, the food that disappeared without explanation, the sounds from above that were dismissed until they could no longer be ignored. These small signs, individually insignificant, collectively pointed toward truths that the people experiencing them were not prepared to accept. We are all like this to some degree, dismissing evidence that contradicts our comfortable assumptions, rationalizing away the anomalies that suggest something might be wrong. It is not stupidity or negligence that makes us miss the signs of hidden intruders, but rather the normal human tendency to seek the most benign explanation available, to preserve our sense of security, even when that security is being quietly undermined. Only in retrospect do the patterns become clear, the individual incidents revealing themselves as parts of a larger story that was unfolding all along, just beyond the edge of conscious awareness. The quiet presence behind us, whether in the attic, the crawl space, the closet, or some other forgotten space, represents something more than just a violation of property or privacy. It represents a challenge to our fundamental understanding of boundaries, to our belief that we can create spaces that are truly our own, controlled and known and safe from intrusion. The discovery that someone has been sharing these spaces without our knowledge forces a reckoning with the limits of our control, with the porousness of boundaries we thought were solid, with the presence of possibilities we preferred not to consider. And once that reckoning occurs, once we know what we now know about the negative spaces in our homes and the desperate or disturbed people who might occupy them, we cannot return to the innocence we once possessed. We can only move forward, carrying this knowledge with us, checking our closets a little more carefully, listening to the sounds in our walls with slightly more attention, accepting that perfect security is impossible, but working nonetheless to create spaces where we can feel safe enough to rest, to relax, to be ourselves without constant vigilance. This is the work of recovery, the slow rebuilding of trust in the face of knowledge that could easily paralyze us if we let it. Chapter 7. The Uninvited That Watch. Stories change as they move through time, details shifting with each retelling, facts blending with speculation, until the line between what happened and what might have happened becomes impossible to discern. The three cases we have explored tonight, Hinterkaifeck, Denver, Osaka, have each undergone their own transformations in the decades or years since they occurred, growing beyond their original circumstances to become something larger, more archetypal, more resonant with fears that extend beyond any single incident. They have become, in a sense, modern folklore, stories we tell not just to recount what happened, but to explore what those happenings reveal about the world we inhabit and the vulnerabilities we carry with us. Hinterkaifeck has accumulated more legend than any of the three, perhaps because it is oldest, perhaps because it remains unsolved, perhaps because the violence that ended the intrusion, if indeed there was an intrusion, gives it a dramatic finality that the other cases lack. Over the century since the murders, countless theories have been proposed, examined, and discarded. Books have been written, documentaries produced, amateur detectives have spent years pursuing leads that ultimately went nowhere. The case has become a kind of mirror, reflecting back whatever concerns or obsessions the investigator brings to it. Some see it as evidence of a calculated serial killer, someone who stalked rural farms looking for isolated victims. Others interpret it through the lens of family dysfunction, focusing on the rumours of incest and abuse that may or may not have had any basis in reality. Still others, particularly those interested in the paranormal, have suggested supernatural explanations, though these require ignoring the very material evidence of a very human killer using a very physical weapon. But the theory that haunts most persistently, the one that connects Hinterkaifeck to our larger exploration of hidden intruders, is that someone was living in the attic, watching the family, learning their patterns, waiting for the moment when observation would transform into something more violent. This theory cannot be proven, but neither can it be entirely dismissed. It fits what we know about the footsteps, the tracks in the snow, the general unease that permeated the household in its final days. It explains how the killer knew when and how to strike, how they felt comfortable remaining at the farm for days after the murders, caring for livestock and lighting fires as if they belonged there. In a sense, if the theory is correct, they did belong there, had made it their home through patient concealment, had earned through long observation a kind of intimate knowledge of the space that the family themselves possessed. The Denver and Osaka cases are more recent, their details better preserved in police reports and media accounts, less subject to the distortions that time introduces. Yet even these have begun to accumulate their own layers of interpretation and meaning beyond the bare facts of what occurred. They are cited in discussions of homelessness, used as cautionary tales in neighborhood safety presentations, referenced in articles about home security and the importance of checking spaces we typically ignore. They appear in online forums where people share their own experiences of unexplained sounds or missing food, seeking validation or explanation for disturbances they cannot quite rationalize away. Sometimes these forum posts lead to discoveries of actual intruders, hidden residents who are leaving just enough evidence to create unease, but not enough to force immediate investigation. Other times, the fears prove unfounded. The missing food explained by family members who forgot to mention they helped themselves. The sounds revealed as ordinary building noises misinterpreted through the lens of anxiety these stories generate. But the stories persist and spread, becoming part of the collective vocabulary of urban fear, joining older tales of danger and violation in the catalogue of things we worry about, even when the actual risk remains statistically minimal. There is something about the hidden intruder narrative that taps into primal anxieties more effectively than many other forms of home invasion or violation. A burglar who breaks in, takes valuables and leaves is frightening but comprehensible. Their motives are clear, their presence is temporary, the violation is finite and can be addressed through locks and alarms and insurance claims. But the hidden intruder operates in a different register entirely. Their presence is extended rather than momentary, their motives are ambiguous rather than obvious, and the violation they represent cannot be fully addressed through physical security measures because it is as much psychological as material. They challenge our sense of knowing our own spaces, of being able to trust our own perceptions, of maintaining the boundaries between private and observed that allow us to relax into authentic versions of ourselves. The hidden intruder says, in effect, that you are never truly alone, that privacy is always potentially illusory, that the walls you trust to protect you may in fact conceal threats rather than exclude them. This is a deeply unsettling message, one that resonates with broader anxieties about surveillance, privacy and control in contemporary life. We live in an era of unprecedented surveillance, cameras on every corner, our digital lives tracked and analysed by corporations and governments, our movements and preferences and relationships converted into data that exists beyond our control or even our full awareness. In this context, the hidden intruder becomes almost a physical manifestation of surveillance anxiety, an embodiment of the feeling that we are always being watched even in spaces where we should have privacy. The person in the attic or crawlspace or closet represents in concrete visceral terms what we experience more abstractly through our awareness of digital monitoring and data collection. Perhaps this is why these stories resonate so strongly in the 21st century, why they are shared and discussed and reimagined across social media platforms and online communities. They give form to formless anxieties, provide a specific narrative framework for understanding the vague sense that our privacy is being compromised in ways we cannot fully identify or prevent. But there is also something older in these stories, something that connects them to folk tales and legends that predate modern technology by centuries. The fear of the stranger in our space, the danger that comes from hospitality extended or boundaries insufficiently maintained, the monster that was inside all along rather than threatening from without. These are ancient narrative patterns, archetypal concerns that humans have explored through story for as long as we have been telling stories. In fairy tales, the threat often disguises itself as something benign. The wolf in grandmother's clothing, the witch who offers shelter to lost children, the stranger who asks to be invited across the threshold. Once the boundary is breached, once the threat is inside, the danger increases exponentially because the normal defences no longer apply. The hidden intruder follows this pattern, but with a disturbing inversion. There is no moment of invitation, no breach of the threshold that could have been prevented through greater vigilance. They are simply there, already inside, having bypassed all the normal markers of entry and presence. This makes them perhaps even more frightening than traditional home invasion narratives, because they suggest that our defences were never adequate to begin with, that the boundaries we thought were solid were actually permeable all along. In Japan, where the Osaka case originated, there is a long tradition of stories about spirits and entities that occupy marginal spaces. The corners of rooms, the gaps between buildings, the shadows that exist in all structures but are rarely noticed or considered. These are the emma, the negative spaces that define and make possible the positive spaces we consciously inhabit. In traditional architecture, these negative spaces were sometimes deliberately incorporated into design, creating intentional voids that served aesthetic and philosophical purposes beyond their structural functions. The space between sliding doors, the gap beneath the raised floor, the shadowed alcove where objects of contemplation might be displayed, all of these serve to remind inhabitants that absence and presence are complementary rather than opposed, that the space we don't occupy is as important as the space we do. The hidden intruder inhabits these spaces, but in doing so corrupts their original purpose, transforming what should be contemplative void into threatening occupied territory. They turn the negative space against us, using our own architecture's inherent gaps and hollows as camouflage and shelter. This feels like a particularly modern violation, a corruption of traditional design principles by the desperate circumstances of contemporary urban life. As we have moved through these stories tonight, a pattern has emerged. The signs are always there, small and easily dismissed individually, but accumulating over time into something that should have demanded attention. The footsteps at Hinterkaifeck, the missing food in Denver, the subtle disturbances in Osaka, all of these represented the hidden intruder's inability to be completely invisible, the traces they left simply by existing in spaces too small and confined to leave no mark at all. But humans are remarkably skilled at ignoring evidence that contradicts our preferred understanding of reality. We rationalize, we explain away, we choose the interpretation that allows us to continue feeling safe and secure even when that security is being quietly undermined. This is not a failure or weakness, but rather a necessary psychological adaptation. If we attended to every anomaly, investigated every small mystery, we would be paralyzed by constant vigilance, unable to relax into the trust that makes daily life manageable. The problem is that occasionally, very occasionally, the dismissible anomaly is actually evidence of something genuinely wrong, something that will eventually demand acknowledgement no matter how effectively we ignore it in the present. So how do we live with this knowledge? How do we maintain the trust that allows us to feel at home in our homes while remaining appropriately vigilant to the possibilities these stories reveal? There is no perfect answer, no formula that balances security and serenity in proportions that work for everyone. Some will choose to emphasize security, installing cameras and locks, and engaging in regular inspections of all the spaces where someone might hide. Others will choose to accept the statistical reality that hidden intruders are rare, that the odds of experiencing such a violation are small enough to justify maintaining trust and ease in their daily lives. Most will probably fall somewhere between these extremes, taking reasonable precautions without allowing fear to dominate their relationship with their living spaces. But all of us, having heard these stories, having considered their implications, carry now a small seed of awareness that was not there before. We know what is possible, even if unlikely. We understand that the spaces we inhabit contain more than we can see, that the boundaries we trust are more porous than we imagined, that sometimes the sounds in the walls are exactly what they seem to be, evidence of presence where there should be only absence. The uninvited watch from their hidden spaces, when they watch at all, which is rarely. Most homes never experience such intrusion. Most attics and crawl spaces and closets remain exactly what they appear to be, storage spaces, structural necessities, architectural features that serve their intended purposes and nothing more. But the stories persist because they reveal something true about the world we have built, about the gaps and margins and forgotten spaces that our architecture creates, about the people who fall through the larger social gaps and sometimes find their way into the physical ones our buildings contain. They persist because they remind us that the monsters are real, even if they are human rather than supernatural, even if they are driven by desperation or disturbance rather than pure malice. They persist because the violation they represent, the loss of privacy, the breach of sanctuary, the discovery that we were never as alone as we believed, touches something fundamental in our need for space that is truly our own, controlled and known and safe from intrusion. And so, we tell these stories, passing them along in conversations and articles and documentaries and podcasts that drift through the night toward listeners who are settling into sleep, who want to be unsettled but not frightened, who seek the strange comfort that comes from confronting fears in controlled circumstances, knowing that when the story ends they can return to their own beds, their own homes, their own spaces that are, almost certainly, very probably, reasonably surely empty of anyone but themselves. The uninvited watch when they watch, from spaces we prefer not to think about. But mostly, mercifully, they do not watch at all. The spaces remain empty, the sounds are innocent, the missing food is easily explained, and the boundaries hold exactly as we need them to. This is the truth we return to after the story's end. That horror is possible but not inevitable. That vulnerability exists but need not paralyze us. That we can acknowledge what might be hiding in the margins without allowing that acknowledgement to poison our ability to rest in the centers we have created for ourselves. The houses remember in their way what has occurred within them. But houses can be cleansed, spaces can be reclaimed, boundaries can be rebuilt stronger than they were before, and we, having learned what we have learned, can choose how much weight to give these stories, how much space to allow them in our own narratives of home and safety and trust. The choice is ours as it has always been, even when we did not realize we were making it. Chapter 8. The Uninvited That Watch. The stories fade now, as all stories must, retreating back into the distance from which they came. What happened at Hinterkaifeck, in Denver, in Osaka, these are events that belong to other people, other times, other places far from where you rest tonight. They are real, but they are not yours. They are documented, but they are distant. You're safe in this moment, in this space, in this quiet hour that belongs only to rest. Your walls stand as they have always stood, solid and familiar, containing only what they have always contained. The spaces above and below and around you remain empty of anything but air and insulation, and the quiet infrastructure that makes modern life possible. There are no footsteps in your attic tonight. There is no one in your crawl space, no hidden presence in your closet. These stories we have explored belong to others, to rare circumstances, to moments that interrupted countless peaceful nights that came before and after. Think of all the nights you have already spent in your home, all the hours of sleep accumulated in safety and peace. These countless ordinary nights vastly outnumber the extraordinary ones we have discussed tonight. They are the true pattern, the reliable reality, the foundation upon which you can rest without fear. As you settle deeper into comfort, let the stories drift away like smoke, like fog, like something that seemed substantial but dissolves when you reach for it. They served their purpose, they unsettled gently, they explored possibilities, they acknowledged fears that exist in all of us. But now their purpose is complete, and they can be released back into the collection of tales we tell when we want to feel a small shiver, before returning to the warmth and security of our actual lives. Your breathing slows, following its own rhythm, requiring no conscious direction or control. In and out, steady and calm, the most fundamental pattern of living. Your body knows how to rest, even when your mind wants to wander into dark corners and hidden spaces. Trust your body's wisdom now, its ancient understanding that this moment is safe, that sleep is possible, that the night holds no particular threat. Let your eyes close now if they haven't already, releasing the last connection to the visible world. This darkness is yours, internal rather than external, safe rather than dangerous, the necessary condition for the rest your body needs and deserves. In this darkness, you can finally let go of vigilance, of awareness, of the constant monitoring that waking life requires. Sleep comes not as something you achieve, but as something you allow, a natural process that unfolds when you stop resisting it. The uninvited that watch. They are not watching you. They are characters in stories, figures from rare and distant events, presences that existed briefly in other people's lives but have no place in yours. Your attic, if you have one, holds only stored belongings and still air. Your crawl space contains only pipes and earth and structural elements. Your closets hold only clothes and boxes and the ordinary accumulations of a life being lived. There is nothing watching, nothing waiting, nothing hidden in the spaces you cannot see. Breathe slowly, feeling the air move in and out, noticing how little effort it requires. Each breath takes you deeper into relaxation, further from the stories we have shared, closer to the rest you need. Your muscles release their tension, softening into whatever surface supports you. Your thoughts slow and scatter, becoming less coherent, more dreamlike, losing the logical structure that defines waking consciousness. This is good, this is right. This is exactly what should be happening as sleep approaches and finally arrives. The night holds you safely, as it has always held you. You're exactly where you should be, doing exactly what you should be doing, moving slowly towards sleep and the restoration it brings. There is nothing to fear in your walls, nothing to watch from your shadows, nothing to disturb the peace you have created in this space you call home. Sleep now, releasing everything we have discussed tonight, letting the stories fade into the background where they belong. The uninvited are not here, have never been here, will not arrive in the hours between now and morning. Your space is your own, your privacy is intact, your boundaries are holding exactly as they should. Sleep comes now, soft and inevitable, carrying you away from consciousness and into the deeper rhythms of rest and dream. Let it come, welcome it, surrender to it completely. The night is long enough for rest, and morning will return when rest is complete. Sleep well, rest deeply. The stories are over now and only dreams remain.